Welcome back to our New Testament Canon study. Tonight is lesson number 10, which will be our final lesson of this series. Okay, so the book of Revelation. This was the last book to be included into the canon, historically speaking. However, the interesting thing is that this book has more historical evidences in favor of it being accepted as genuine than many of the other books in the New Testament. And what I mean by that is that this book is easily traceable back to the apostolic fathers, those who were direct students of the apostle John himself. They personally knew John. They knew the book, and they accepted it as belonging to the apostle John. Justin Martyr, for example, whose name you've heard me mention a number of times, he wrote about this book. Actually, he was defending Christianity in his apologist documents, and that's where he mentions the book of Revelation. Then you had Melito, who died in 180 AD. He was a bishop of Sardis, and by the way, that's one of the churches addressed in the book of Revelation. And Melito, he also acknowledges it as John's book. And Irenaeus, who again was a student of Polycarp, who was a student of the Apostle John. And then you have Clement of Alexandria, Origen, Tertullian, and many others. All of them accepted it as genuine without any discussion or debate. I mean, we're talking about a lot of sources which go back to direct, first-hand connections with the Apostle John. I mean, who else could have been in a better position to know what book belonged to John and which one did? Okay, so what's the issue with this book? Well, the first serious issue appeared in the mid-3rd century by Dionysius. He was a bishop of Alexandria. And what he did was a comparison of the book with the other books that John wrote, and he noticed that there were differences in the character of the writer. In other words, his thought and style and the linguistic differences, between those other works and this book. And so really his doubts are coming from internal evidences. It had nothing to do with the solid historical evidences that existed. Therefore, he accepted the book. It was that it was authorized by John. It was supported by John, but maybe, he's saying, John didn't pen the book by himself. Now that's possible, but there's no way to prove it because he couldn't prove it either. However, internal issues, they were not the only ones. There were also external doubts that came up. Primarily, it was from the fact that many Gnostics used the book to sell their crazy ideas and their false teachings. I mean, that'd be similar to those today who would use the book to push their doctrine, such as millennialists who teach that, teach the idea of a limited 1,000-year reign of Christ, or the idea of the rapture, which is included in their thoughts. But by the way, that the word rapture is not actually found in the book of Revelation at all. Heresies like Montanism, I should say, also known as Chiliasm, they used Revelation to support their charismatic false doctrines. Those ideas were very popular, even among some Orthodox Christians in the 2nd century. But eventually, those ideas were recognized as false and were discarded as heresy. And so, on the one hand, the book was very popular among the Gnostics and the false teachers, which explains why Orthodox Christians may have had a hard time with the book. And on the other hand, in the 3rd century, there were internal stylistic differences compared to the other books that John wrote. And so, if the author of Revelation was not the Apostle John, or not connected with him, or any other apostle, you know what that means, right? It's not inspired. Therefore, it should be discarded. And so, putting all those issues and concerns together, this is what 3rd century Christians did. They threw the book out, they excluded the book of Revelation. But here's the problem, which apparently they figured out. These doubts came from subjective opinions. In other words, personal opinions, like Dionysius of the 3rd century, he noticed those stylistic differences. However, internal differences of style are in no way conclusive to reject any book, which we talked about already in the past. The stylistic differences are there, yeah, and may be considered significant, but This is not the first time that we came across stylistic differences, and the historical evidences are way too strong to be thrown away. There are different ways to consider how those stylistic differences might be explained, but there's no way or any reasons to discard the historical evidences just because of those stylistic differences. Therefore, when considering all these things, the Christians far and wide eventually accepted revelation into the canon as being inspired. After a lot of due diligence, a lot of work, in spite of the Gnostics who favored the book, in spite of any doubts that individuals raised, the evidences in favor of this book are much stronger than anything against it. They took their loyalty to Jesus Christ very seriously. Their lives depend upon it. And so we looked at just a small portion of the historical documents available to us, and we can understand why then that these 7 books were at one time doubted in the early 3rd century. But we also now know why all 7 books were finally included in the canon, which is why we have them to this day in our Bibles, and why we have no logical reason to reject any of them. And so that leaves us with the remaining group, the 20 New Testament books that were always universally accepted into the canon. You had the 4 Gospels, you had the book of Acts, the Romans, 1st and 2nd Corinthians, Galatians, Ephesians, Philippians, Colossians, 1st and 2nd Thessalonians, 1st and 2nd Timothy, Titus, Philemon, 1st Peter, and 1st John. All 20 were never rejected. Early Christians from the very beginning, from so many locations and regions all across the Roman Empire, they were using and they were quoting from all of these books. Historical evidence shows that basically no one ever expressed serious doubt about any of these 20 New Testament books. However, problems arose only in recent modern times, where some people, they start doubting it for whatever reason. Well, for example, you got modern scholars that doubt the pastoral epistles, as they call them, were not written by the Apostle Paul. They doubt that. And that those epistles, they would be 1 Timothy and Titus. And then you have some who also doubt that Ephesians was written by Paul. But these doubts have nothing to do with external historical evidences, which tells us that the very early church never doubted them, never doubted any of them, including Timothy, Titus, and Ephesians. So why would someone 2,000 years later start to doubt? Well, it has to do with 2 things: analysis of the style of the text, and second, the theology. But again, we're talking only about internal evidence. They completely discount all the historical evidence. But again, why? Well, it has to do with a basic mindset which believes that the New Testament teachings and the Christian movement itself evolved over hundreds of years. They believe that the church was initially more charismatic and that it was less structured, without any hierarchy, at least very early on. For example, they believe that bishops and deacons were only introduced and invented by man over time, that these offices really didn't exist in the very beginning. I mean, if that's your mindset, if that's what you believe, then what would you think about letters like 1st Timothy or Titus or even Ephesians? I ask that because that's where Paul talks about bishops and deacons. In other words, church structure. And so if you have the mindset that the church structure evolved over centuries, then you would think that, of course, Paul could not have written about bishops because it was too early in the movement. They claim that nothing like that existed in the beginning, that there were no bishops or deacons, no hierarchical structure at all. Therefore, they say someone else had to write those letters much later on. If you're not a true Christian, or you don't want to believe in God, nor the possibility of God inspiring individuals, to reveal his truth, then Christianity and the whole New Testament, is nothing more than a human production. I mean, since those things could not have happened instantly in your mind, then you need to come up with a story of how those things gradually came about, how these different ideas were simply made up and invented by willing accomplices and added gradually over time. They claim that the stories of how Jesus was initially just a good teacher, and then he became the Messiah, because of people's imagination, and then over time he became God. You'd contrive stories of how the Christian church evolved over centuries upon centuries into what it is today. The problem is the facts and historical evidence that exists does not support their theories at all. Actually, what has been invented and made up are their theories. All the evidence that exists shows that what we have in our hands today, in other words, these documents, existed in the first century. And it is the inspired word of God. These unchanged documents were not made up over time. And you see, all of this, it has to do with their worldview. Once you take the atheistic or the skeptic worldview, there's no other way you can explain the existence of Christianity. You're forced to go along those lines of coming up with theoretical constructs with the primary purpose of trying to discredit this amazing book that we call the Bible. That's why this study of how we got this book is so important, in my opinion. And we only scratch the surface. The history of the early church is beyond amazing. How this movement suddenly appeared on the world stage in the environment of the first century Rome in the Roman Empire, and it grew so rapidly. I mean, this is unprecedented. It's like no other movement in the history of mankind. And it has survived for 2,000 years and counting. I mean, think about it. This movement and this book, which explains the movement, both have survived against all the odds and against everything, all the challenges that it faced over all these centuries. And it will continue to face. But it survived because God has his hand in everything. Now, it wasn't miraculous. He didn't use miracles, no miraculous intervention that he used to preserve the New Testament books. It was through natural means, which can be proven and shown as evidence. He used both friend and foe to accomplish what he wanted, to have a communication tool that has stood the test of time, a book that can be verified as accurate and true, a book that any honest heart will treasure and respect the same way as those early Christians treated these documents when they first started to receive them. And they were willing to die. So this concludes our study. If you have any questions at all, please email them to me. I respond to all my emails. Send it to Drew at Bible-moments.com. And you can also use the form at the bottom of this page. I mean, if you're watching this video on our website, you'll see this form at the bottom. Our website is Bible-moments.com. So I hope you enjoyed watching this series as much as I enjoyed presenting it. And again, I want to thank you. Thank you for watching. And I pray that you have a blessed